I found the text messages while looking for my phone charger in Paul's car. 9 months pregnant, swollen ankles threatening to burst from my shoes. I'd waddled out to his BMW at 11:47 p.m. because my phone was dying and I needed to time my contractions. The Braxton Hicks had been coming all day, irregular but insistent. And Dr. Fowler had told me to monitor them carefully, since this was my first pregnancy. Paul was in the shower, probably washing off the scent of whatever perfume she wore. I'd smelled something floral and expensive on his collar earlier, something I definitely didn't own. When I leaned across the center console to reach the charging cable tucked beside his seat, his phone lit up with a notification. The contact name made my blood freeze. Sarah. The preview showed enough. Can't wait for tomorrow night. He said she's due any day, so we'll have to be extra careful for a while. My hands shook as I picked up his phone. No passcode, he'd removed it months ago, claiming he wanted to be completely transparent with me. The irony would have been laughable if I wasn't fighting the urge to vomit. I scrolled through weeks of messages, photos I couldn't unsee, plans they'd made around my pregnancy appointments, jokes about my whale-like appearance that had made her laugh with crying face emojis. The worst part wasn't the intimacy, though the graphic details made me feel like my skin was crawling off my body. It wasn't even the money he'd spent on her. Dinners at restaurants he claimed were too expensive when I'd suggested we celebrate our anniversary there. It was the casual cruelty, the way they'd planned their encounters around my doctor visits, how she'd asked if he was sure the baby was his and he'd replied with a shrug emoji and does it matter at this point. I sat in that car for 23 minutes reading 2 months of betrayal while my unborn daughter kicked against my ribs as if she could sense my heart breaking. The motion sensor lights in our driveway had turned off twice, leaving me in darkness with the blue glow of his phone screen and the weight of knowledge I couldn't unknow. My name is Elena Fowler-Smith, and I was 32 years old, sitting in my cheating husband's car, realizing that everything I'd built my life around was a lie. I'm a senior financial analyst at Morrison & Associates, the kind of person who reads fine print and spots discrepancies others miss. I'd taken maternity leave 2 weeks early because Paul had convinced me to rest and focus on the baby. Now I understood why he'd been so insistent about me staying home. For 3 years, I'd been the primary breadwinner while Paul found himself as a freelance marketing consultant. I'd paid for this house, this car, the fertility treatments when we struggled to conceive, the private insurance that would cover our daughter's birth. I'd worked 60-hour weeks right up until my 8th month building our savings account, setting up college funds, making sure we were financially secure for our growing family. I'd sacrificed promotions that required travel, turned down the London transfer that would have advanced my career by years, all because Paul said family came first. He'd cry about feeling inadequate as a provider, so I'd reassure him that money wasn't everything, that his support meant more than any salary. While I was building our future, he'd been building a relationship with Sarah Kramer, a 26-year-old yoga instructor he'd met when I'd bought him a gym membership for his birthday. The baby kicked again, harder this time, as if reminding me that in approximately 18 hours, I'd be induced if labor didn't start naturally. Dr. Fowler had scheduled me for 6 a.m. tomorrow. If tonight didn't bring the real thing, I was about to become a mother, and my daughter's father was planning to celebrate by spending the night with his girlfriend. I took photos of everything. Every text, every photo she'd sent, every plan they'd made. My hands were steady now, clinical. The same focus that made me excellent at spotting financial irregularities kicked in. I documented dates, times, amounts he'd spent on restaurants I'd never been to. I screenshotted the messages where he'd complained about my weight gain, my mood swings, my constant neediness. I saved the photos she'd sent him wearing lingerie I'd seen charged to our joint credit card. When I heard the shower turn off upstairs, I carefully placed his phone exactly where I'd found it and walked back into our house. Paul emerged from the bathroom 20 minutes later, hair still damp, wearing the cologne I'd bought him for Father's Day. A premature gift since our daughter wasn't born yet, but I'd thought it would make him feel connected to his new role. "Hey babe, how are you feeling?" he asked, kissing my forehead with the same lips that had probably been planning tomorrow's lies. "Any more contractions?" A few, I said, watching his face for tells. Irregular still. Dr. Fowler said, if they don't get stronger tonight, we'll head in tomorrow morning as planned. Perfect, he said, and I caught the flash of relief in his eyes. I'm pretty tired, think I'll head to bed early. Actually, I said, settling into the chair that had become my command center these last few weeks, my laptop within reach, all my important documents organized in the filing system I'd maintained since college. I think I'll stay up a bit longer. You know how it is, too uncomfortable to sleep much these days. He kissed me again, told me he loved me, and headed upstairs to our bedroom where he'd probably text Sarah about how boring his pregnant wife was. I waited until I heard our bedroom door close, then opened my laptop and began to work. Truth is, I wasn't surprised. The signs had been there for months, maybe longer. Paul had always been charming. The kind of man who could talk his way into or out of anything. It's what had attracted me to him initially. The easy confidence, the way he could make anyone feel like the most important person in the room. But charm is a double-edged sword, and I'd learned that people who can make you feel special can make others feel the same way. The changes had started small. New clothes that were too trendy for his usual style, bought when I wasn't with him. A sudden interest in fitness that went beyond his typical gym routine. He started working later, taking calls in the garage or outside, claiming clients were more available in the evenings. Weekend client meetings that never seemed to result in actual contracts. His phone habits changed first. Where he'd once left it carelessly around the house, it became an extension of his hand. He'd take it to the bathroom, charging it on his side of the bed instead of the Kit Fowler counter where we'd both always plugged in our devices. When it buzzed during dinner or while we watched movies, he'd glance at it with an expression I couldn't quite read, anticipation mixed with something like guilt. The sex tapered off gradually, which he blamed on my changing body and his fear of hurting the baby. Dr. Fowler had assured us that intimacy was safe throughout pregnancy, but Paul became increasingly distant. He'd go to bed earlier or later than me, claim exhaustion or headaches. When we did have sex, it felt perfunctory, like he was checking a box rather than connecting with his wife. Then there were the financial inconsistencies. As someone who reconciled our accounts weekly, I noticed the charges. Small at first, coffee shops in parts of town he had no business being in, restaurants during lunch hours when he'd told me he was working from home, gas station purchases that didn't align with his claimed whereabouts, a spike in ATM withdrawals that he explained as cash for various small business expenses. The emotional distance was harder to quantify, but impossible to ignore. Conversations became surface level. He stopped asking about my day, my pregnancy symptoms, my fears about becoming a parent. He'd zone out when I talked about baby names, nursery plans, or my excitement about our daughter's arrival. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at his phone with a smile I hadn't seen directed at me in months. Looking back, I think the moment I knew for certain was 3 weeks ago, when he forgot about my baby shower. He'd promised to help set up, to be there for the whole event. Instead, he texted an hour before guests arrived, claiming a client emergency required his immediate attention. My sister had to help me arrange tables and hang decorations while I fought back tears and made excuses to friends who asked where my husband was. He came home that evening with flowers and apologies, but the damage was done, not just to me, but to his relationship with my family and friends. My mother, who'd always liked Paul, spent the rest of the evening asking if everything was okay between us. My sister pulled me aside and asked point blank if he was having an affair. I'd denied it then, not because I didn't suspect, but because I wasn't ready to face the reality. But I'd started making quiet moves anyway. Financial protection had been my first priority. I'd opened a savings account in my name only, transferring small amounts that wouldn't be noticed, but would accumulate into something substantial. I'd changed my direct deposit to split between our joint account and my individual one, claiming I wanted to practice managing finances for when I'd be on maternity leave. I'd documented every unusual expense, every inconsistency in his stories, every time his claimed location didn't match his actual behavior. I'd started taking photos of his odometer readings when he'd claimed to be working from home, but the car had clearly been driven significant distances. I'd noted the times he'd shower immediately upon coming home, the new clothes that appeared in his wardrobe, the credit card charges he couldn't adequately explain. Most importantly, I'd secured copies of all our important documents: marriage certificate, insurance policies, mortgage papers, tax returns, bank statements. I'd scanned everything and stored digital copies in a cloud account he didn't know existed. I'd also made physical copies, stored in a safety deposit box I'd opened in my name only at a different bank than where we kept our joint accounts. I'd even started researching divorce attorneys, not because I was planning to leave him, but because I wanted to understand my rights and options. I'd learned about asset protection, custody laws, and how infidelity might impact divorce proceedings in our state. I'd bookmarked articles about dividing debt, handling joint property, and protecting children's interests during divorce. The pregnancy had complicated everything. Part of me had hoped that becoming a father would refocus Paul's priorities, that he'd end whatever this was and recommit to our marriage. But as my due date approached and his behavior became more erratic, I'd realized that wasn't going to happen. If anything, he seemed to view the baby as an inconvenience, something that would tie him down and prevent him from living the life he apparently wanted. So I'd prepared for multiple scenarios. I'd arranged for my sister to be my emergency contact for all medical situations. In addition to Paul, I'd set up a separate bank account with enough money to cover several months of expenses if I needed to leave quickly. I'd researched family law attorneys, and even had a consultation with one, claiming I was asking hypothetical questions for a friend going through a difficult divorce. Now sitting in my living room at nearly midnight, reading the evidence of my husband's betrayal, while my daughter moved restlessly in my womb, I was grateful for every precaution I'd taken. Tomorrow, I'd bring our child into the world, but tonight, I had work to do. The first discovery had been devastating, but as I methodically went through the evidence, the full scope of Paul's deception became clear. This wasn't a recent affair, or a moment of weakness. This had been going on for at least 4 months, possibly longer. The text history I could access only went back to when he'd gotten his current phone, but the casual nature of their communication suggested a relationship that had been established well before their first message in my evidence file. I found restaurant receipts in his email that dated back 6 months, dinners for 2 at expensive places he'd never taken me. There were hotel charges on his personal credit card, the one I'd rarely monitored because it was supposed to be for business expenses. Flowers ordered and delivered to an address I didn't recognize. Gifts purchased from jewelry stores and lingerie boutiques. The financial betrayal was almost as bad as the emotional one. While I'd been carefully budgeting for our new baby, setting aside money for diapers and formula, preparing for the income reduction during my maternity leave, he'd been spending freely on his girlfriend. A quick calculation showed he'd spent over $8,000 on his affair in the past 6 months alone. Money from our joint accounts, money we'd allocated for our daughter's future. But the evidence also revealed something else. Paul was stupid. For someone who claimed to be a marketing professional, he'd left a digital trail that would make any forensic accountant weep with joy. He'd used our shared computer to research restaurants and hotels. He'd saved her photos in a folder on his desktop labeled Client Materials. He'd even synced his calendar to our shared account, which meant I could see every business meeting he'd scheduled with Ence Kramer for the past 4 months. More damaging still, he'd discussed me in detail with her. Not just my appearance or our relationship, but confidential information about my job, my family, my medical history. He'd told her about my mother's struggle with infertility, making jokes about how it ran in the family and questioning whether the fertility treatments we'd needed were worth the expense. He'd shared details about my salary, my work projects, even my fears about childbirth that I'd confided to him during vulnerable moments. I discovered that Sarah wasn't just his girlfriend, she was his exit strategy. In messages from 3 weeks ago, they'd discussed moving in together after the baby was born. Paul planned to file for divorce once he was sure he couldn't be accused of abandoning his pregnant wife. They'd researched apartments together, calculated how much child support he'd likely owe, and discussed whether he should fight for joint custody or just pay and be done with it. Reading those messages while feeling my daughter kick inside me was like being stabbed repeatedly with a dull knife. This man who'd held my hand during ultrasounds, who'd assembled her crib and painted her nursery, who'd cried when we found out we were having a girl, he was actively planning to abandon both of us. But their messages also revealed critical information I could use. Sarah didn't know about my financial position or my career. Paul had painted me as a dependent wife who'd struggle without him, someone who'd probably move back in with her parents after the divorce. He'd lied about my income, my education, and my professional capabilities. He'd even suggested that I might not fight for significant assets because I'd be too overwhelmed with the baby to deal with legal complications. That was his first mistake. His second mistake was underestimating my professional skills. As a senior financial analyst, I'd been trained to investigate complex financial structures, to identify hidden assets and irregular transactions. I'd worked on cases involving corporate fraud, embezzlement, and asset concealment. Paul had no idea that his wife could forensically dissect his financial life with surgical precision. His third mistake was assuming I'd be isolated and friendless during this crisis. While he'd been building a secret relationship, I'd been building professional networks and deep friendships. My colleagues at Morrison & Associates included some of the best financial investigators in the state. My sister was a paralegal at one of the city's most prestigious family law firms. My best friend from college was now a family court judge in the neighboring county. I spent the first hour after my discovery making a comprehensive list of every asset, account, and investment we owned jointly or individually. I logged into every financial account and took screenshots showing current balances and recent transaction histories. I documented his business income for the past year, including payments from clients I'd never heard him mention and deposits that didn't match his claimed earnings. Then I moved on to the evidence of his affair. I organized the text messages chronologically, highlighting the ones that showed financial expenditures, references to shared assets, or discussions about our divorce. I created a spreadsheet tracking every expense related to his relationship with Sarah, categorizing them by date, amount, and type of expenditure. The violation of our privacy was extensive. He'd photographed bank statements and left them on his phone. He'd screenshotted emails from my employer about my maternity leave benefits. He'd even taken pictures of documents from my home office, including information about my retirement accounts and investment portfolios. Sarah had those photos. She knew details about our financial situation that some of my closest friends didn't know. As I worked, my contractions continued irregularly. Every 20 minutes, then 15, then 25 again, strong enough to make me pause and breathe, but not consistent enough to indicate active labor. It was fitting. Somehow, even my body was waiting for me to finish what I'd started. By 3 a.m., I had a complete dossier of Paul's betrayal, financial records, communications, documented lies, evidence of asset dissipation, and proof of his plans to abandon his family. I'd also used his computer access to explore his email accounts, social media messages, and even his browsing history. The picture that emerged was of a man who'd been living a double life for months, systematically deceiving his pregnant wife while planning his escape. But I'd also found something else in his digital footprint, evidence that this wasn't his first affair. Buried in old email accounts were conversations with other women, dating back to the early years of our marriage, hotel reservations and dinner receipts that predated Sarah by years. A pattern of infidelity that made me realize I'd been naive to think this was a recent development or a temporary lapse in judgment. Paul wasn't having a midlife crisis, or struggling with the pressure of impending fatherhood. He was a serial cheater who'd been betraying me throughout our entire marriage. The only difference was that this time, he'd gotten careless and left evidence where I could find it. That realization was liberating in a way I hadn't expected. The guilt I'd been feeling, wondering what I'd done wrong, how I'd failed as a wife, whether I could have prevented this, evaporated. This wasn't about me or my shortcomings. This was about his character, his choices, and his fundamental inability to honor the commitments he'd made. I thought about my daughter, moving restlessly inside me as if she could sense the tension. She deserved better than a father who'd view her as an inconvenience. She deserved to grow up seeing healthy relationships, understanding that love meant loyalty and respect. She deserved a mother who was strong enough to protect her from people who would hurt her, even if one of those people was her own father. The next morning, I called Dr. Fowler's office and confirmed my induction for 6 a.m. Then I made 3 other phone calls. The first was to my sister, asking her to meet me at the hospital. The second was to my mother, letting her know the baby would be coming today. The third was to Amanda Richardson, the family law attorney I'd consulted months earlier, asking if she could meet with me sometime in the next few days. When Paul woke up at 7:30, I was already dressed and had our hospital bag waiting by the door. Contractions started about an hour ago, I told him calmly. Dr. Fowler wants us to come in now. His face went through a series of expressions: surprise, calculation, and what might have been disappointment. Now. But I thought, are you sure it's time? I'm sure, I said, picking up my purse and the folder containing copies of all the evidence I'd gathered. Let's go meet our daughter. The drive to the hospital was quiet. Paul kept glancing at his phone, probably wondering how to let Sarah know that their plans had changed. I focused on breathing through contractions that were now coming every 8 minutes, strong and purposeful. My body was ready to bring this baby into the world, and my mind was ready for everything that would come after. At the hospital, Paul played the part of the devoted husband perfectly. He held my hand during the admission process, asked questions about my comfort, and made sure the nursing staff knew I was allergic to latex. He posted updates on social media about becoming a father, accepting congratulations from friends and family who had no idea what kind of man they were celebrating. My sister arrived as I was being moved to the delivery room. She took one look at my face and knew something was wrong beyond the normal stress of labor and delivery. "Are you okay?" she whispered, when Paul stepped out to make phone calls. "Ask me again tomorrow," I said, squeezing her hand as another contraction peaked. "But yes, I think I'm going to be better than okay." Labor progressed quickly once it began in earnest. My daughter was born at 3:47 p.m., weighing 7 pounds and 2 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and my brown eyes. She was perfect, tiny fingers that grasped mine immediately, lungs that announced her arrival with impressive volume, and an alert expression that suggested she was already assessing her new environment. Paul held her for the first time with tears in his eyes, and for a moment I almost believed his emotion was genuine. He whispered to her about how much he loved her, how he'd always protect her, how she was the most beautiful baby in the world. He took dozens of photos and sent them to what he claimed was our family group chat, though I suspected Sarah was receiving copies as well. "What should we name her?" he asked, though we'd discussed this extensively and had agreed on Isabella Elena, after both our grandmothers. "Isabella," I said firmly. "Isabella Elena Fowler-Smith." I'd hyphenated her last name during the birth certificate process, a decision I'd made weeks ago but hadn't mentioned to Paul. Let him discover that surprise along with all the others. The first night in the hospital passed peacefully. Isabella nursed well, slept in reasonable stretches, and charmed every nurse who entered our room. Paul stayed overnight, sleeping uncomfortably in the chair beside my bed, periodically checking his phone and looking increasingly agitated as Sarah presumably demanded his attention. I watched him struggle with divided loyalty and felt no sympathy. Soon enough, he'd have to choose between the life he'd built with me and the fantasy he'd constructed with her. But that choice would come with consequences he wasn't expecting. The next morning, as we prepared to leave the hospital, I made the call that would begin the next phase of my plan. "Amanda? It's Elena Fowler-Smith." "Yes, she arrived yesterday, beautiful and healthy. I'd like to schedule that appointment we discussed. Tomorrow if possible." Paul was busy getting discharge instructions from the nurse, and didn't hear the conversation. He'd been distracted all morning, clearly frustrated by his inability to communicate freely with Sarah. I'd noticed him typing and deleting messages, stepping out of the room frequently, and growing increasingly tense as real life interfered with his secret relationship. "Is everything set up at home?" I asked him as we loaded Isabella into her car seat for the first time. "Oh yes," he said quickly. "Everything's ready. I made sure the house was clean, stocked the kit Fowler," set up the bassinet in our room. You just focus on recovering and bonding with the baby. He was being unusually helpful, probably feeling guilty about the time he'd already planned to spend away from us. According to the messages I'd read, he'd promised Sarah he'd find ways to see her even with the baby situation. He'd told her that newborns slept most of the time, and that I'd be too exhausted to notice his absences. That was going to be another costly miscalculation. We spent Isabella's first week home establishing routines and adjusting to life as new parents. Paul was attentive during the day, helping with feedings and diaper changes, taking photos and videos to share with family. But I noticed his phone habits intensifying. He'd disappear to check work emails several times a day, always taking his phone with him. He'd volunteer to run errands that should have taken 30 minutes but stretched to 2 hours. 3 days after we came home, he announced that he needed to meet with a potential new client. "It's a big opportunity," he explained. "They want to meet tomorrow evening to discuss a long-term marketing contract. I know the timing isn't ideal, but..." "Of course," I said, feeding Isabella while sitting in the nursery we'd painted together. "What company is it?" He hesitated just long enough for me to know he was preparing a lie. "Meridian Solutions. They're expanding their digital presence and need a comprehensive strategy." I made a mental note to research Meridian Solutions later. "How long do you think you'll be?" "Probably a couple hours. Dinner meeting, you know how those go. But this could be really good for us financially, especially with the baby expenses." The irony was staggering. Paul was planning to continue his affair under the guise of providing for his family, while simultaneously planning to abandon that same family. The man who'd spent $8,000 on his girlfriend in 6 months was now claiming concern about baby expenses. "That sounds great," I said. "I'll probably go to bed early anyway." Isabella had a rough night last night. That evening, while Paul was presumably having dinner with his client, I had my own meeting. Amanda Richardson came to my house, armed with legal pads and a briefcase full of forms. Isabella slept peacefully in her swing, while we spread evidence across my dining room table. "This is one of the most comprehensive infidelity cases I've seen," Amanda said, reviewing the financial records I'd compiled. "He's been incredibly careless with documentation. The asset dissipation alone gives us significant leverage, and the evidence of ongoing deception during your pregnancy strengthens your position considerably." We spent 2 hours mapping out a strategy. Amanda explained how Paul's behavior constituted marital waste, the legal term for one spouse squandering joint assets on an extramarital affair. In our state, I could potentially recover not just my portion of the money he'd spent on Sarah, but damages for his deliberate depletion of our joint resources. "The timing of your evidence gathering is also crucial," she continued. "Because you documented everything before filing for divorce, we can establish a clear pattern of deception and financial irresponsibility. This isn't a vindictive wife trying to punish her ex-husband, this is a careful documentation of ongoing fraud. More importantly, the evidence I'd gathered would support my case for primary custody of Isabella." Paul's messages showed a clear lack of interest in parenting, his willingness to prioritize his affair over his family, and his intention to minimize his involvement in his daughter's life. The court would be very interested in reading his casual discussions about paying child support rather than actually parenting his child. "What's our timeline?" I asked, watching Isabella's peaceful sleep and feeling a fierce protectiveness that surprised me with its intensity. "I'd recommend filing within the next week," Amanda said. "Every day you wait is another day he can spend joint assets or create additional complications. Plus, the longer you wait, the harder it becomes to argue that you discovered this information recently." We scheduled a follow-up meeting for 3 days later, when Amanda would have the initial paperwork prepared. I'd file for divorce, request an immediate injunction preventing him from accessing our joint accounts, and seek temporary orders for custody and support. By the time Paul realized what was happening, his financial options would be severely limited. The next morning, he came home with flowers and expensive pastries from my favorite bakery. "How did your client meeting go?" I asked, accepting his kiss and noting that he'd showered before coming home, probably at Sarah's apartment. "Really well," he said, settling into his performance. They're interested in a 6-month contract with potential for extension. Good money, flexible schedule. It'll be perfect with the baby. That's wonderful. When do you start? Next week probably. I'll need to do some evening and weekend work initially. But once we establish the relationship, it should be more predictable. I nodded sympathetically, mentally adding this conversation to the list of lies I'd be documenting for court. Paul was creating an entire fictional narrative to explain his continued absences, apparently confident that I'd never question his story or investigate his claims. That afternoon, while he was working from home in his office, I did a quick internet search for Meridian Solutions. The company existed, but their website showed no indication of recent expansion or marketing initiatives. I found their staff directory and noted that their current marketing was handled internally by a full-time team. No outside consultants mentioned anywhere. I also traced the address where Paul claimed to have had his dinner meeting. It was a residential building downtown, expensive apartments that catered to young professionals. Building directory showed S. Kramer in Unit 412. Paul hadn't even bothered to research a convincing lie. He'd essentially told me he was meeting his girlfriend in her apartment, counting on my trust and naivety to prevent me from asking follow-up questions. The casual contempt behind that level of carelessness was almost more hurtful than the affair itself. He didn't just think I was ignorant about his activities. He thought I was stupid enough to believe anything he told me, too insecure to question his explanations, and too dependent to do anything even if I discovered the truth. He was about to learn how wrong he was on all counts. 3 days later, Amanda and I finalized the divorce paperwork in her office while my mother watched Isabella. The petition was comprehensive, requesting dissolution of marriage based on irreconcilable differences, but including detailed allegations of adultery and financial misconduct. We requested immediate temporary orders for exclusive use of the marital home, primary custody of Isabella, and an injunction preventing Paul from accessing our joint accounts or incurring additional joint debt. Are you ready for this? Amanda asked as we prepared to file. Once we submit these papers, everything changes. He'll be served within 24 hours, and his attorney will undoubtedly advise him to stop communicating with you except through legal channels. I thought about Isabella, barely 2 weeks old, sleeping peacefully in her carrier beside my chair. I thought about the messages where Paul had joked about his boring wife and questioned whether he wanted to be involved in his daughter's life. I thought about the $8,000 he'd spent on another woman while I'd been preparing for our child's arrival. I'm ready, I said. The papers were filed that afternoon. Paul would be served at home the following morning, when he'd be expecting another normal day of balancing his double life. Instead, he'd discover that his pregnant wife had been far more observant and far more prepared than he'd ever imagined. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in months. The secret knowledge had been a weight I'd carried alone, but now I had professional advocates and a clear legal path forward. Isabella would grow up knowing that her mother had been strong enough to protect both of them, intelligent enough to gather the evidence needed for justice, and brave enough to rebuild their lives on a foundation of truth rather than deception. That evening, Paul announced another client meeting for the weekend. They want to finalize some details about the contract, he explained. Saturday evening, probably another dinner meeting. Of course, I said, feeding Isabella and marveling at how easy it was to let him dig his grave deeper. Will you be late? Probably. These things tend to run long. Don't wait up. By Saturday evening, Paul would have been served with divorce papers. His weekend plans would definitely be disrupted, though not in the way he was expecting. I wondered if he'd still try to keep his date with Sarah, or if the reality of legal consequences would finally break through his fantasy world. I was about to find out. The process server arrived at 8:47 a.m. on Friday morning. I watched from the nursery window as Paul answered the door in his bathrobe, accepted the envelope with a confused expression, and stood reading the papers on our front porch for several minutes. Even from a distance, I could see the exact moment he realized what he was holding. His face went through a series of transformations: confusion, shock, disbelief, and finally, anger. He looked up at the house as if seeing it for the first time, probably calculating how much it was worth and how much he stood to lose. Then he stormed back inside, and I heard his office door slam. Isabella stirred in her bassinet, disturbed by the noise, but settled back to sleep when I stroked her cheek. "It's okay, baby girl," I whispered. "Daddy's just learning about consequences." Paul stayed in his office for 2 hours, presumably calling attorneys and trying to understand his legal position. When he finally emerged, his initial anger had been replaced by a calculated calm that I recognized from our dating years, the same expression he'd worn when trying to talk his way out of speeding tickets or negotiate better deals with salespeople. "Elena," he said, sitting on the edge of our bed where I was folding Isabella's laundry, "we need to talk. I imagine we do. This is crazy. Filing for divorce without even discussing our problems. I know I haven't been perfect, but every marriage has rough patches. Especially with a new baby, everything's stressful and dour." "Paul," I interrupted gently. "I know about Sarah." The color drained from his face. "Sarah? I don't know what you... I know about the apartment downtown. The restaurants, the hotels, the jewelry. I know about the $8,000 you've spent on her in the past 6 months. I know about your plans to move in together after you divorce me. I know you've been telling her details about my finances, my family, and my medical information." He stared at me for a long moment, probably trying to calculate how much I knew and how I'd found out. "Elena, listen. I can explain. I know you told her the baby might not be yours. I know you've been planning this divorce since my 2nd trimester. I know you researched how much child support you'd owe, and whether you could avoid joint custody." My voice remained steady, almost conversational. "I know because I read your messages. All of them." The mask finally slipped completely. "You went through my phone? That's a violation of privacy. You can't use that in court." "Actually, I can. You removed your passcode months ago, remember? Claimed you wanted complete transparency between us. Well, congratulations. You got it." Paul stood up and began pacing, his mind clearly racing through his options. "Look, this doesn't have to get ugly. We can work something out. Shared custody. Reasonable support. Split the assets fairly. No need for lawyers and court battles." "You mean no need for me to recover the marital assets you've been squandering on your girlfriend? No need for the court to review your fitness as a parent based on your own written statements about not wanting to be involved in Isabella's life?" "That's not... I never said I didn't want to be involved. I love Isabella. She's my daughter." "Really? Because 3 weeks ago you told Sarah that child support might be cheaper than dealing with the whole custody thing. You called our daughter an obligation and asked whether you'd be legally required to take her overnight or if you could just do weekend visits." The fight went out of him then. Paul sank back onto the bed, head in his hands, finally understanding that I hadn't just discovered his affair, I'd documented his complete plan to abandon his family. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. "I found your messages the night before Isabella was born. And you've been planning this whole time." "I've been protecting my daughter's interests this whole time. There's a difference." We sat in silence for several minutes. Isabella made soft sleeping sounds from her bassinet, oblivious to the destruction of her parents' marriage happening a few feet away. Paul looked at her with an expression I couldn't read, regret maybe, or just embarrassment at being caught. "What happens now?" he asked finally. "Now you move out. Today? Amanda's filing for temporary orders on Monday, and I suspect the court will grant them given the evidence of asset dissipation and your documented intentions regarding custody. You'll have supervised visitation with Isabella until we can establish a permanent arrangement." "Supervised? Elena, come on. I'm her father." "You're a man who spent the week after her birth planning to abandon her. A man who questioned her paternity to your girlfriend. A man who discussed ways to minimize his involvement in her life. The court takes those things seriously." He tried arguing, bargaining, and eventually pleading. He promised to end things with Sarah, claimed the affair was a mistake, swore he wanted to be a good father and husband. But the words felt hollow, scripted, like a performance he'd rehearsed for this exact scenario. I listened patiently, occasionally offering him tissues when the emotional manipulation escalated to tears. But I felt nothing but determination to protect Isabella from the chaos Paul had created. By evening, he'd packed 2 suitcases and loaded his car. He'd agreed to stay at his brother's house temporarily, probably because his attorney had advised him that abandoning the marital home entirely could hurt his case. He held Isabella for a long time before leaving, whispering apologies she couldn't understand for mistakes that would shape her entire life. "I do love her," he said, as he handed her back to me. "Whatever you think of me, I love my daughter." "Then prove it by being the father she deserves," I replied. "Not the one you've been planning to be." After he left, I sat in Isabella's nursery and fed her while watching the sunset through windows Paul had installed when we'd first bought this house. Everything looked the same, but everything was different. The life I'd planned was over, but the life I was building felt more honest, more hopeful. My phone buzzed with text messages from family and friends who'd somehow learned about the divorce filing. Word travels fast in situations like this, especially when legal papers get served. I answered the messages that mattered and ignored the ones that felt like gossip seeking. My sister arrived within an hour, armed with takeout food and a bottle of wine I couldn't drink while nursing. "Are you okay?" she asked, the same question she'd posed in the hospital but with different urgency now. "I'm better than okay," I said, surprising myself with how true that felt. "I'm free." The legal process moved quickly once it began. Amanda had been right about the strength of our evidence. Paul's attorney advised him to settle rather than risk a trial where his messages and financial records would become public testimony. The court granted our temporary orders without opposition, giving me primary custody of Isabella and exclusive use of our home while the case proceeded. Paul's assets were frozen pending a full financial disclosure, which revealed even more evidence of his deception. The forensic accountant Amanda recommended discovered additional expenditures on Sarah, hidden credit cards, and even a secret savings account Paul had been funding with money diverted from our joint income. More damaging to his case was the discovery that he'd lied to me about his business income for over a year. He'd been earning significantly more than he'd reported to me. Money he'd used to fund his lifestyle and affair while letting me believe we needed to budget carefully for the baby's expenses. The final settlement gave me the house, primary custody of Isabella, and a financial package that reflected both the assets he'd hidden and the marital funds he'd squandered. Paul received weekend visitation rights once Isabella was older, and an obligation to pay child support based on his actual income, rather than the reduced amount he'd been claiming. Sarah apparently had not expected the affair to become such an expensive proposition. According to mutual friends, she'd ended the relationship within a week of the divorce filing becoming public. She'd signed up for an exciting secret romance with a married man, not a messy divorce case with financial transparency requirements. 6 months later, Isabella and I had settled into our new life with comfortable routines and a sense of security I'd never felt during my marriage. I'd returned to work part-time, with my mother providing childcare and Paul exercising his visitation rights reliably if not enthusiastically. The house felt bigger without the tension of Paul's divided loyalties. Friends visited regularly, bringing dinner and baby gifts, marveling at how much happier I seemed despite being a single mother. My sister had been right that divorce suits me. I was sleeping better, laughing more, and making plans for the future that included only the people who'd proven their loyalty. Paul had moved into a small apartment downtown and was reportedly dating again, though more carefully this time. He paid his support obligations on time and saw Isabella according to the schedule, but he'd never developed the deep parental bond I'd hoped fatherhood would create in him. Isabella was comfortable with him but didn't seek him out the way she did with me or my family. I watched them together during custody exchanges and felt grateful that I'd acted when I did. Paul was a decent part-time father, but he never would have been the full-time partner I'd needed or the primary parent Isabella deserved. The divorce had freed all of us to become the people we actually were rather than the roles we'd been trying to play. The most unexpected outcome was how the experience had changed my relationship with trust and love. I'd thought Paul's betrayal would make me cynical about marriage and relationships, but instead it had taught me to value people who showed up consistently, who chose me and Isabella deliberately rather than by default. My colleagues at Morrison and Associates had rallied around us during the divorce, offering everything from professional references for Amanda to babysitting so I could work late when needed. The women in my neighborhood had created an informal support network, sharing childcare duties and creating the kind of community I'd tried to build with Paul but had never achieved. Most importantly, Isabella was thriving. At 6 months old, she was happy, healthy, and surrounded by people who adored her unconditionally. She'd never known the tension that had filled our house during the final months of my marriage, never had to compete with her father's divided attention, never had to wonder whether she was wanted or just endured. One evening, as I was putting her to bed in the nursery Paul and I had painted together, she looked up at me with his brown eyes, but my determined expression. "You're going to be okay, baby girl," I whispered, stroking her cheek as she drifted off to sleep. "We both are." And I realized, as I turned off the lights and headed to my own bedroom, larger now without Paul's clothes crowding the closet, quieter without his secret phone calls disrupting the peace, that it was true. We were more than okay. We were exactly where we belonged. The betrayal that had broken my heart on the night before Isabella's birth had ultimately led us to a life built on honesty, surrounded by people who'd chosen to love us rather than simply tolerating our presence. Paul had given me many gifts during our marriage, but his infidelity might have been the most valuable one of all, the gift of clarity about what kind of life I actually wanted to live, and the courage to build it for myself and my daughter. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never found those messages, if Isabella had been born into the marriage I'd thought we had, rather than the one that actually existed. But those thoughts never last long. The truth had been uncomfortable, but it had also been liberating. And liberation, I'd learned, was worth any amount of temporary pain. Isabella stirred in her sleep, making the soft sounds that meant she'd wake soon for her nighttime feeding. I settled into the nursing chair we'd bought when I was still married, in the room we'd prepared when we were still pretending to be happy, and prepared to feed my daughter in the house that was now truly ours. The future stretched ahead of us, uncertain but honest, challenging but full of possibility. We'd built it together, Isabella and I, on the foundation of truth rather than fantasy. And that, I thought, as she latched on and began to nurse contentedly, was the best gift I could give her, a life where love meant commitment, where promises were kept, and where she'd never have to wonder whether she was truly wanted. The baby who'd been conceived in deception was growing up in truth, and both of us were stronger for it.